So welcome to Agile Denver and Kanban SoCal's Meetup Mashup for tonight, October 21st. Thanks everyone from wherever you happen to be for joining us tonight. My co-host is Van Ray. I am Kristen McLemore, and we are really happy to have all of you join us today to see and hear from Frank and Joey. So I'm going to start us off with a little bit of a socialization just for the first few minutes. So if you've not used Zoom, which I cannot imagine, but it may be that you're using some other type of video conferencing tool, I'm going to launch a couple of questions in the polling section just to get to know you better and for us to share where you happen to be. And because there are so many options here, just bear with me because we didn't want to make this as if it were a state exam. And there are quite a few questions and answers, so scroll and you will see the second, the third, and the fourth question. Oh. I'll give everybody a couple of minutes because we want to know, where are you joining us from? What is your mood barometer? Are you in the poopers or are you actually happy as a clam? We want to see where everybody is mentally, emotionally. And the third question is, have you ever used Kanban outside of work? Holy moly. Yes, you can. I hope a lot of people say yes. And then just for a little bit of fun, hand on your heart. Is anybody wearing pajamas? And that is where we're going to be. All right, did everybody have a chance?
I think so.
We're good, we're good. All right. So let's see, we've got about 13 people coming in from Colorado. We got California and we have Texas. I'm so glad I added that state to this list because I almost didn't. I almost thought, oh, I'll just do California and Colorado and then everywhere else. So welcome from wherever you are. And for the barometer, let's see. Most people are around a 6 out of 7. That's not bad. Or is that right? 5 out of 7. That's not bad. I'm glad somebody answered with, yeah, I can't even. That's the answer. And let's see, how many of you have actually used Kanban outside of work? So we're almost at a good split. So that's cool. I'm interested to hear some stories. And nobody's wearing their pajamas. Well, there might be a couple of you. And then some of you are just going to let your imagination run. I actually bought a pair of pajama bottoms that were from the Despicable Me, the Minions. Is anybody else a fan of the Minions? Like, I just can't get enough of them.
Yep.
I don't even have children. That's what my friends are like. You don't even have kids. Why do you like the Minions? I'm like, I don't know. They're just funny because they don't make any sense. It's kind of like being at work.
Just a quick question. Sorry to interrupt you. How do you publish the poll? I mean, how do you get the poll questions to the audience? Is there any option in Zoom you can actually? Oh, okay. So
when
I don't have an enterprise.
Yeah, when you're an administrator of the Zoom and you're the host, you can either set it up in advance or you can do it when you join.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. All right, so I want to go back to the third question about, have you ever used Kanban outside of work? So tell us a little bit about that. Anybody want to share?
I'll share.
Go for it, Mike.
Outside of work is very relative, right? Because it may be easy to describe something that kind of sounds like work, but in addition to being an Agile coach, I also own a business, a diesel truck repair business, which, believe it or not, has a lot of overlap with Lean, Agile, and Kanban. But two families purchased the business about 14 months ago, and we used Jira and Kanban to purchase the business. So we had to borrow millions of dollars. We had to go through all sorts of hurdles and, I mean, just crazy amount of work. It took a year to purchase the business. And so literally the 4 owners and the only one that had ever used Jira before or knew anything about Kanban. And we set up the Jira board and we, everybody had stories and tasks and we met twice a week and we worked it all the way across the board. And it was really funny because once the business was purchased, one of the owners was like, hey, I want to keep doing this. And I kind of knew it would all fall apart once we started operating. it was a woman, and I obliged. So I was like, all right, well, we'll continue the board. And I was right. It all fell apart. We stopped track.
Anyone else have a story of Kanban outside of work?
I will confess, Kristen, that I don't use Kanban per se, but almost everything I do when I'm driving or standing in a line or whatever, I can't help but think about pull policies and what's going on here. And how is TSA doing this? And how is Panera Bread doing that? And why is Colorado Department of Highway doing this? And just anyways.
That's great, because I remember when I was actually traveling quite a bit for work, every time I go to the airport and I am even slightly motivated to go through the Panda Express line, I immediately look at queuing and how many people are serving food and how many people are actually at the registers, because if those aren't balanced, I was like, oh, if I could only show them.
Yeah.
Well, I have a smaller version of a family Kanban system that we run in my household. So it's something I can share with people if you'd like to see what it looks like. It's a Trello board. So, but yeah, I do use Kanban. I actually limit how much I do, how much I say yes to with my family. Yeah, someone else did that maybe too.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's sanity in a marriage for me. I love it.
Well, I am not ashamed to admit that I've been using Trello for probably about 2 years exclusively, and I have more than 5 different boards.
Good
And
for you.
one of them, I actually call it Get Shit Done. And it's a merging of everything. So all the boards for personal, for work, for Agile Denver, for volunteer, all of them have their separate places. But once they're going to happen in the next 2 weeks, I move them to that GSD board and then manage it through there. So it's pretty awesome.
Awesome.
I don't measure myself, though. I'm not doing metrics. I'd kind of draw the line on being a little bit too over the top with that.
I've done it a little bit because it helps me to calibrate, because Van knows me well. I'm a little too much of an optimistic planner. And I'll be like, oh, we can get that done relatively quickly. And my wife is like, no, you're off on this. And I go, no, I'm pretty good with this. I think I'm right. And then I pull the numbers on my board and I'm like, oh, I'm going to be quiet now. And I'll listen to her.
Yeah. Well, we have 2 more minutes before we get started on introducing our 2 speakers and having them give the session. Any more sharing of Kanban outside of work stories you want to offer? All right. Well,
no, go ahead.
Sorry, was that somebody who was going to offer up a question?
I was just going to say, I guess you can see who the speakers are as Joey and I both take sips of water.
Yeah.
And other people who are hydrating in their own way.
That's true. Yes. It is kind of late for some people, so we understand that. All right. Well, what I wanted to do is thank everyone, first of all, for joining us for tonight. It's a little bit later than our normal start time because we are accommodating multiple time zones tonight, and specifically the West Coast, where Joey and Van are kind of catered to for their meetup group that we're mashing up with for tonight. So I want to start us off with Frank Vega. So I want to share a little bit of a personal story about how I met Frank, and he may not even remember this, but years ago when I first moved to Colorado, I was looking for people to call my new friends because I had lived on the East Coast for about 20 years, moved out here with no connections to anyone, no family, no friends. But I knew that the Agile community was a great place to start. So someone had recommended that I go to a meetup. And over the course of that next couple of months, I tried to volunteer. I even went to an event where Frank happened to be. And someone said, well, if you really want to meet somebody who is a really great person and knows a lot about what you're interested in, you need to go talk to that guy. And it was Frank. And I remember coming up to him while he was sitting at the table, probably engrossed in trying to get something done. And I knew I was sort of like one of those fangirls that was like, hi, Frank, my name's Kristen. And I just moved to Colorado and I was told to meet you and blah, blah, blah. And he could not have been more warm and kind and everything like that. So I had a wonderful experience at the entire event and really appreciated that I found out later that Frank actually runs one of our community of practices or SIGs, special interest groups within Agile Denver, and they focus on Kanban. So tonight, what we've asked for Frank, as well as Joey, to do is do a little bit different type of meetup. So it's a little bit like a TED Talk style as far as the timing of it. So we're only going to spend like 15 to 17 minutes per person talking about their topic. Frank tonight is going to focus on highlighting some assumptions that we make that are relative to this notion of stable systems. First, he's going to talk about Little's Law. Then he's going to talk about theory of constraints. So I think I want to see some head nodding where they're like, well, yeah, I've heard about it, or I know it very intimately. And relate that back to implementing specific pull systems effectively. And then last, he's going to go through some highlights on relating the statistical process control limits to assess predictability of workflow. So with that, I will hand it over to Mr. Frank.
Wow, I think that's what I said. It's going to be close. It's going to be close to that. So, okay. So let me see if I can do this right. I'm going to go ahead and, well, first of all, let me just start off, kind of pick up where Kristen left off. First of all, hello, everyone, and good to see we have a nice crowd here, it looks like. So I want to first thank Kristen and Van. I don't know where Van went. Oh, there was Van up in the right-hand corner for the invitation and the opportunity to present tonight. So one of the first things that I asked Kristen when she reached out to me was, is there some specific topic that you want me to speak on? And Kristen said, any topic of interest to me was on the table. And so I thought, well, why not something that I'm already spending a lot of time studying right now? And so I threw out, how about if I talk about a connection that I'm seeing between lean, theory of constraints, and statistical process control? And I thought that would get me off the hook. And immediately Kristen said, yep, that works. And I said, well, all right, then I guess I'm in. So with that, let me go ahead and I'm going to share my screen. And let me make sure that that goes. Okay. Is that looking right over there, Kristen? Trusting you'll keep me. Everybody see that screen?
We're good, Frank.
Okay. Oops. Didn't mean to click on it so already. Okay. If everybody can see that, because I've got two screens and it's kind of everything's all over the place. I just want to make sure you see me and my screen. Okay. So this slide is really it. This is my main takeaway for you all tonight. The rest of the presentation is me just trying to convince you why I think this is so important. So when I started studying lean and TOC and SPC, I saw them mainly from this perspective of tools. And so my focus, quite honestly, early on was, how do I implement them? And that's where I stayed for quite a while. However, over time, I began to expand that perspective. And I realized that they weren't just tools, but they were more actually unique ways of thinking about continuous improvement. And I started to see connections between these unique ways of continuous improvement as well. And one of those notions, or excuse me, one of those connections is this notion of a stable system. And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit tonight. Now, as I started digging into these assumptions, though, about what makes a system stable in each of these contexts, I saw that I was really gaining some very valuable and what I think are necessary insights into why these tools work and when they don't work so well. And I became really concerned that it's quite easy to be on. So that's my elevator pitch for you all tonight and why I'm doing this presentation. Okay, slide 2, hopefully that switched. So now I want to expand a little bit visually on this, elevator pitch summary that I just gave you. My study of these three started with lean, and this was back in 2005, 2006. I was working with teams, and our primary interest was, how do we get a pull system in place? We had this push system, and the consequences of that, many people do. And so we started looking at Kanban and Conwhip. And I began to wonder, well, is there a little bit more than that? And we saw these other tools, cumulative flow diagrams and Little's Law. And it wasn't long after I started looking at these that I saw references to TOC and statistical process control as well. So from TOC, the tools that I kind of looked at early on were the 5 focusing steps and drum buffer rope. And from SPC, it would be the XMR chart, which is also called process behavior chart, but the specific one is an XMR chart. And it has process limits on it, which help you determine whether something's in control or not. It's not necessary to know all that just now. I'm just giving you an idea of some tools that I was looking at in SPC and TOC in conjunction with the tools that I was looking at in lean. So with that, so it was several years that, as I said, I was using these tools primarily from this perspective of just the tools and the implementation. But around 2011, I obviously had a lot of free time on my hands, and I got really curious about how in the heck do those CFDs work? There's no way I can explain them tonight in a short talk, but just take my word for it. You don't see how you get an approximate average flow time from just connecting two dots on the chart, and I couldn't figure out how that would work. So I said, you know, I'm going to start digging into this and seeing how these things can work. And as I did that, I saw that there was this link to Little's Law. And between CFDs and Little's Law, they linked up by this notion of a stable system. But what did that really mean? And over time, with lots of conversations with a few colleagues of mine, we began to realize that these things just don't work by magic. There's some key assumptions that they're based on. And this really, really opened my eyes. It was easy for me to see how limiting WIP could balance the inflow with the outflow. And that notion of a stable system, I could see how that coming out of that. But we were learning there's more to it that was necessary. So to kind of give you a flavor of what I'm talking about, think about this situation here. Think about you standing in line, and the line is moving, but it's not moving very fast. It's moving kind of slow. And you see some folks in front of you drop out of the line. How does that make you think about the line that you're standing in? What does it make you feel like doing? Staying in line or getting out as well? Think about this too. As you're standing in that line, you start to find out that folks up front of you are cutting in line. How does that make you feel about the service that you're waiting for? Does it make you a little upset or a lot upset? And then also, you start to notice that the line is moving just a little bit slower than when you first got into it. And then a little bit longer, it's moving even slower. How does that make you feel? So think about those things, because that's what the Little's Law and CFD, some of the assumptions are based on, are those are kinds of things you should be thinking about. So in our context, here's what it made us start to do. We began to think about how often were we throwing out work items after we had spent time working on them? How did that impact the CFD that we were using and the calculations that we were getting from using Little's Law? How often were we allowing work items to cut in front of those that were already in the to-do column, or worse, cutting in front of work items that we had already started working on? And how was that waiting time in the to-do column? How was it appearing over time? Was it getting longer than what we had already told other people prior, maybe weeks later when we first received their item, about how long it would take? So those kind of questions, if you didn't catch them, those are related to the first three questions I just asked, but this is more of a workflow concept, but those other ones are more general. So you can think about those later at another time too. So in summary, we were learning to think very differently about the explicit policies that we were using to control the work as it moved through our workflow, and even how we pulled the work into our workflow. And more importantly, we were also thinking very much differently about those implicit and those ever-changing policies that are related to expediting items in the workflow. And so we were realizing that, using CFDs and computing numbers with Little's Law could easily misguide us unless it was done with some understanding of those assumptions that these tools are based on. And so, as they say with other tools, analytical tools, garbage in, garbage out, and it applied here as well. All right, so I'm going to fast forward a little bit. So just in that same way that I did that with Lean and those tools that I mentioned, in particular, CFDs and Little's Law, that process repeated for me with those tools in TOC and SPC. I moved from just using them to trying to figure out why and how did they work. And I observed again that each of these had some notion of a stable system. There was some difference about what a stable system meant. There were some differences about the assumptions, but there was nothing indicating that they were mutually exclusive of each other. Keep that in mind as we go. So let me just go through TOC just a little bit further now. So, it was easy for me to see how a fixed constraint in my workflow process would be the area that I'd want to make my priority if I wanted to increase the overall flow of the system, and how that fits with this notion of a stable system. But as I learned more about the assumptions, I began to realize that we also needed to think about some other questions. So in general terms, think about these situations. They're all driving for whatever reason. If you're driving behind a bus in the right-hand lane, knowing that you have to make a turn soon, what do you think about when you're behind that bus? And I know what many of you would probably say. And on a busy mountain road, and I know many of your states have mountains too, and you're behind some big trucks and you're going uphill, and there's none of those dedicated passing lanes available. What does that make you think about your trip as you're going uphill and behind that big truck? And then on a busy multi-lane freeway, what do you think about those drivers who are not obeying that law, keep right except to pass, when you're trying to get to a location on time, so to speak? So keep those questions in mind because they're very general, but they're also very similar to these questions that I began to understand are necessary to ask when you're using these TOC tools that I mentioned. Does the constraint in your workflow ever noticeably move? Example, due to batch size or work type? And is the demand on your workflow highly variable, or are there predictable patterns of increase or decrease? And is your demand on your workflow all similar small sets of products and services, or are there a wide variety of products and services? And believe it or not, those questions relate to the first three questions that I just asked you about traffic. So from SPC, again, I mentioned the other two tools, the XMR charts and the natural process limits. And so it was easy for me to see how, if my data points were within my control limits, that had a fit with some notion of a stable system. But now think of these situations. If you're going to be using these SPC tools, think about these situations, and they're based on the assumptions that these tools are based on as well. Let's say you work in a company and you notice that numerous coworkers are clearly abusing your company's flex time policy, but it's going unnoticed by any managers. How does that make you feel about your system there? Think about this system. You're watching somebody and they have the TV on, the radio on, and a vacuum cleaner on while they're trying to make a phone call to 911. Think about that context. And then also this last one, your oven timer goes off, your cell phone goes off, and the doorbell rings at pretty much the same time. What do you hear and what do you respond to? So believe it or not, those are related to these kinds of things that we started to ask ourselves based on our workflows as well. And those are you analyzing your workflow with a coarse-grained aggregate measure derived from several processes combined? Is the time frame of the metric that you're using or collecting, is it too wide so that you're really combining several key changes occurring that are masking as one? And is the time frame of the metric you're using so narrow that you're really seeing a lot of things that look like signal, but when you look at them collectively, they're just a bunch of noise? And believe it or not, those three questions relate to the earlier ones I said as well. So, you'll have to think about those a little bit over time. The point is, all of those are based on understanding the assumptions a little bit better of each of those tools, whether they're from Lean, TOC, or SPC. So this visual is also important for another reason. It's not just a visual of my journey, of my study, it's also a visual of my mental perspective at that one time. And that was, if these assumptions didn't fit nicely underneath one of these toolboxes, my thinking was I simply just need to go to the next toolbox. However, as I gained more experience with these tools and I began to look at more workflows in different system contexts, I began revisiting those earlier conversations I had with colleagues about stable systems and the assumptions related to CFDs and Little's Law. But now these conversations were integrating insights about stable systems from TOC and SPC as well. And when I did that, this is how that picture changed in my mind. Instead of seeing those workflows now fitting nicely in one of these domains, if you will, these multiple perspectives of a stable system and the assumptions that these tools were based on allowed me to see many of the workflows that I was working on more and more now as a mix of issues related to fitting to these assumptions about stable systems, and not just from one of these domains, but from multiple domains simultaneously. Now, I have a background as a software architect, and it made me think about a pattern that I heard about long ago called a ball of mud. And it reflects something that the great systems thinker, Dr. Akoff, once said. And he said, managers don't solve simple, isolated problems, they manage messes. And so for me, as I learned and studied these assumptions for these tools and got beyond the implementation, I began to see that many of my workflows were balls of mud or messes. And so it made it challenging for me to think that I could just use tools from one of these toolboxes without thinking about tools from the other. So I realized my perspective of the toolbox had to change as well. And so now this picture is where I'm at based on this study of the assumptions of these tools. As you can see, it changed not only my vision of the workflows that I was working on, but the tools that I had at my disposal. So yes, this toolbox still has all these tools, their unique insights about stable systems and the assumptions. However, now I'm seeing how we can synthesize the insights of these assumptions and begin to integrate these tools and create new ways of solving and addressing these messes that I'm pointing to down there. And so here's a real world example. Now, this actually happened before 2011. This was back in 2008. So remember, I have to go back in time here. And this is with teams that I was working with, and we were trying to implement those pull systems. And we'd only dug into the assumptions of CFD and Little's Law, very little, nowhere near to where I'm at now. But we were seeing a difficult time trying to fit Kanban or DBR pull systems into our context. So what we did at the time is we took our best shot at ConWhip, which we really didn't understand. And we knew it was a pull system, and we tweaked our policies to fit as best we understood, guided primarily by what we had learned about CFDs and Little's Law at the time. And to our surprise, it worked very well for our context. Now, this is before 2011 and after 2008, when I had conversations with colleagues, I often was kind of ashamed to admit, but I thought it was pretty much just by luck that it worked so well. However, fast forward now to where we're at today, and based on what I've learned in the last few years, and in particular the last year, about all these assumptions and these tools, I really deeply understand now how ConWhip, by design, took design features from Kanban, from DBR, and even from push systems, and combined them together. And I see now how are the assumptions that we made and the adaptations that we made, I should say, fit the assumptions that we knew at the time, and how they actually worked to produce and give us the outcome that we wanted. So it wasn't luck. It was really just a lack of trust based on the fact that we didn't have the experience fully yet that we have today, and based on those assumptions. But now, fast forward to where I'm at today, it all makes a lot of sense. And so that brings me back to kind of where I started and why I think this message is so important. So just as I had done earlier as a software architect, and I saw how valuable it was to understand the assumptions that my tools were based on, I see myself today as a process or systems architect, realizing once again how important the assumptions are of the tools that I use, seeing how it gives me a foundation for being able to customize them and adapt them as needed for my specific context. And more importantly, and probably more powerfully, it allows me to take just bits and pieces of these tools now, just like I used to extract from coding frameworks, and fit them together and create my own new integrated solutions for my context. And so for anyone who may have started on their own journey and is a little stuck on right now, or you're anxious to get started on maybe learning more about these flow kinds of concepts, here's a few references that I would point you to. And there's also my contact information down there. I'd be more than happy to hear about your journey and what you're exploring and learning, and share with you a little bit more about mine if you're interested. So with that, Kristen, I'll go ahead and stop sharing, and then we can, I think, hand it back over to you and to Joey. Thanks.
Thank you, Frank.
Awesome. So are you ready for me, Kristen?
I think Van's going to introduce you.
Oh, right. Sorry.
All right. Good evening, everybody. My name is Van Ray. I'm the host of Kanban SoCal. It's my pleasure to introduce Joey tonight. I'm just going to give a just brief background on Joey and introduce his talk. Joey's an accredited Kanban trainer and a Kanban coaching professional and an accredited Kanban consultant at TriTech Enterprise Systems based in the Washington, D.C. area. He has an 18-year career spanning communications, insurance, higher ed, nonprofit, and government sectors. And Joey has been a software developer and an IT director, a strategic analyst, a coach, and a technical systems expert, and a consultant. Joey holds a bachelor's in business administration from the University of Florida. And I'm personally excited, and I appreciate Joey being willing to share tonight. He's going to be talking about getting to yes. And he's going to be explaining how feedback from a Kanban system can inform and develop how you replenish that Kanban system with a goal of getting to yes. And with that, I will hand it off to you, Joey.
Thanks, Van. So I'm taking this from a very beginning mindset of using Kanban as I talk about how to get to yes, because I find a lot of people, including myself, as we just talked about with family Kanban, there's a desire to say yes to a lot of things, and you realize you might be overburdening yourself with yes. So I'm going to take you through a little bit of a journey here of kind of helping us to explore what yes really means. And I'm going to bring up a little something here to walk you through it. There we go. And so what we're talking about here is really how you say yes to work today. And reflect for a moment as I go through this. How are you saying yes today to work? Are you saying yes because I accept a ticket? Are you saying yes because I give a thumbs up verbally or through email that we've got it, we're working on it? Or maybe you say yes because we're having a conversation before we say yes. You know, 3 different ways of kind of getting to that yes in your way of working. And I want to know, just reflect for a second, how is that working out for you? Is that a positive thing? Is that the way it is right now? It's good for you, works well, or maybe it's a little bit weird, right? Maybe it's not the way you want it to be. Maybe there's some unbalance there, you know, talking about balance prior to this, maybe there's a little bit of a balance issue here possibly. And so what I find happens for me in my world with work is that when we do say yes, often what happens afterwards is shift happens, right? And you know, there's getting shift done, I guess, in some ways. We were just talking about getting work done. There's this idea of how shift can happen in a business. And with COVID happening lately, boy, talk about a shift, right? You had plans for the entire year probably, and they've all shifted around because of what's happened in your environment. Now, I take sage advice from one of my best advisors in the field of Kanban, and that is Vanilla Ice. And Vanilla Ice has the best phrase ever. He says, stop, collaborate, and listen. And that to me is an oracle. He really is. He was ahead of his time. He really knew what he was talking about when he put together that beautiful medley of Ice, Ice, Baby. And so I've been thinking about this a lot. I've been thinking about how does ice, you know, Vanilla Ice really help me to think more critically about replenishing a system. And he says, you know what? You got to use the feedback from your Kanban environment to get that yes from a lowercase y to an uppercase y yes, which really means you're growing up. You're getting cooler with how you say yes. And so what kind of feedback is so cool that it's ice, ice, baby, cool? Because that's really what's going to matter here. I want to impress Vanilla most of all when I'm doing my work. And so Vanilla says to me, hey, stop and visualize, collaborate with these metrics, and listen while reviewing and planning with your Kanban system. And so when I think about visualize, I talk to my other advisors here, my Agile heroes really, which are the Beastie Boys. And they say to me, what you see is what you get. And I'm like, well, then what does that mean? And here's an example of what we're talking about when we mean visualize. You know, you say yes to a lot of things, right? And you can say yes, and you can start to see where it shows up in your visualization of a Kanban board. And so when we're looking at Kanban boards, we're looking at what we've said yes to, and there's probably going to be places here and there that start to pile up. Kind of like what Frank was talking about. Somewhere in there, things start to get stuck, right? You start to see things bottling up in a Kanban system. And sometimes that's the very person we said yes to. We're waiting for them to say yes back to us that we built something right, that we got it in the right format. And we need them to say yes before we can say it's done. And so that visualization starts to inform sort of who's acting with the system, who's behaving with the system. And that kind of tells you a little bit more about what to do. Maybe some decisions you might want to make, because you may be saying yes to someone who looks very important, and they're so important, they don't actually get back to you and tell you if it's a yes from them when you actually say, is this done? And so you can start to have a lot of yeses to VIPs, and before you know it, the VIP is not so important to actually come back to your system and tell you this was done right. So that's kind of a gotcha that can happen from time to time. But that's one way of starting to visualize where some things are going on. Now, back to Vanilla, he did say collaborate with metrics to me. So when I think about collaborating with metrics, I want to be able to look at the data from my Kanban system. Now, that means you're starting to track when you started doing something and when you finish something, and doing that multiple times over your piece of work, right? You have multiple pieces of work going through your system. You're going to start to figure out what an average looks like and maybe what a percentile looks like. Now, this is kind of getting mathy and geeky, but what we're looking for is if we say yes, how likely are we going to have it done? Now, again, this gets back to Frank's thing. Frank and I could probably go off on hours of this, of what it means to actually talk about stability. So ignore Frank, ignore your brain for a moment here and just assume this is good, reliable data, and assume for a second here that we have an 85% chance of getting something done in 29 days. Now we're able to go back and talk about how much time something might take. So we've got a way of looking at the work and where it is in process. Now we have a way to looking at our metrics and kind of talking about where things might be going. So then that's another piece of communication that we get, another feedback that we get from our system. Now we move over here to the last bit of this, which is listen while reviewing and planning, right? Communicating and collaborating. Now, believe it or not, the Muppets back in 1977 had planning figured out, and they had a whole song about it, and it's called the Planning Song. And I can't find it on YouTube. If I did, I would have played it tonight because it's fascinating, right? It is about talking about how do we actually look at what we've got and make a decision on what we're committing to before we just start to say yes automatically. And so we're really thinking about, do we see it? Do we understand how it will work in our environment? And do we have a conversation about what's next relative to what we've already said yes to? So in Kanban systems, you can limit what you do, but that's up to you. And if you want to go that far, that's a really good thing to do. Oh, there we go. We got someone who's looking at the Muppets. So there's a winner right there for the Muppets, little young man there. So when we're thinking about getting to yes, we're really thinking about three things to go from lowercase yes to uppercase yes. And we're talking about reviewing what we've already said yes to, reflecting on what yes means by looking at our data, and then discussing what we could say yes to before we say yes to it overall. And then last but not least, if you can, you should whip it and whip it really good. And by that, I mean, limit how much you put into your work in progress, how much you say yes to. Some of you understand that. It's a tough place to be. It's a next step when you start to commit to something and replenish your system. So remember, when we're replenishing, we're going to look at the metrics, we're going to look at the visualization, and we're going to look at the conversation and actually see if we're actually communicating before we just jump right into the yes. And having a limit having a limit on what you do can really inform you even more and help you grow up a little bit more about what can't go into your system versus what can go into your system. And so that is my little bit of a talk right there on getting to yes. And that's my information in case you want to reach out to me. Thank you so much for having me here.
All right. Well, I just wanted to close out our session for tonight and say a special thank you to Van for connecting with me across the state lines so that we can do this mashup together. And a thank you to Frank Vega and Joey Spooner for being our presenters for this evening. And to all of you for joining us tonight. And I hope this is helpful to everyone, and have a great weekend. I know it's only Wednesday, but we got to start early.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kristen. Thanks, Van.
Thanks,
very much.
everyone.
Thank
See you
you.
around.
Thank you so much.